get started with the next session. So folks that are fantastic, thank you. So folks who would like to, please come in, find a seat. We'll have lots of time to continue conversation this evening at Esperanza's Mercado La Paloma, the best party that ArtPlace is involved with this evening. I can say that with absolute certainty. So, all right. All right, welcome. All right, so we're going to launch into a session that sort of looks at people and place and people, whatever combination we want to look at. I was in a breakout session earlier today, and Danny from the YOLO Art and Agriculture program looked at me at one point and said, I just want you to know that YOLO is located in a literal field and we have an actual silo. So, in terms of field building and silos, I think we should all go to YOLO. So, I sort of touched on this a little bit yesterday in the opening session. I think it was Nato who asked a question that sort of led me to this. There's something, I think, that's somehow endemic to the language of placemaking, where place is almost talked about as if it's empty. And that I think for the purposes of the work that we're all doing, places are very much collections of people. And so we have two fabulous speakers and conversation partners who sort of look at people and do that. And so the first is Manuel Pastor, who I think a lot of you may know. He's a professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity here at USC, where he also serves as director of the program for environmental and regional equity and co-director of USC's Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. So he's someone who very much looks at groups of people. And I don't know, I think it dates back before Grantmakers in the Arts, but I think a lot of us in the arts field sort of got to know your work and its relevance to the arts field when Janet Brown and the board of GIA invited Professor Pastor to make a presentation to them. And the other person sitting here is not Thom Mayne. So anyone who's changing their eyeglasses, do not get worried. Thom, unfortunately, had a last-minute conflict and wasn't able to be with us, but we have his fabulous partner in crime, Yi-Sung Lee, who's currently a principal of Morphosis Architects with Thom and director of the Now Institute at UCLA, and I think busy at work on Dakamomo and some other great projects here and in Asia as well. And Yi-Sung and Thom are architects and designers who sort of think about places, but their approach to those places is very much informed by the people in them, how they're being used, what's happening in them, and the cultures of those places. So our plan for the next little bit is that each speaker is going to present for about 20 minutes. We'll have an opportunity for them to have a little conversation between them and among the three of us. And then we'll really open it up and we'll use the second half of the session as a chance for all of us to engage in conversation together. So that's what I've got for the moment. And if there's nothing else, I will invite up Professor Manuel Pastor. Please help me in welcoming him.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Particularly because you're so close to USC, it was a very easy commute for me. Naturally, I drove because I'm an Angelino, and that's our human right to drive short distances. You know, I wanted to relate to you what I was asked to talk about because I went back to the email and I noticed that when Jamie asked me, he said that this would be an important way to look at places as living collections of people. That he also hoped that I would discuss equity, inclusion, arts, and sustainability through the lens of geography, American studies, and ethnicity. He then wanted me to look at the ways that people influence place, place influences people, and the non-static nature of people and places. He then asked me just a week ago whether or not I would discuss comprehensive immigration reform and the likelihood of it passing in this congressional session. Just yesterday, he called me. I was somewhat panicked. He wanted me to comment on Putin's invasion of the Ukraine and whether or not art could play a role in sort of bringing folks together. And just on the way up here, it was sort of a surprise to me. He whispered that he was hoping that I would comment on the tragedy that occurred this last year when a woman who'd done so much for intercultural understanding but then been denied the Nobel Peace Prize, Siley Myrus. Whether or not, I mean, it's twerking after all. And by the way, if you didn't get that joke, you're way too old. So what I'm going to do instead is talk a little bit about demographic change, a little bit about placemaking, a little bit about the role of art. And before I do, and I pardon if some of you have heard this, some of you have not. While I'm speaking, my voice might break a little bit. I actually have a speech disorder that's called spasmodic dysphonia. It's what Diane Reems on NPR has. So it will sound like I'm being emotional. I am. But I always like to assure people, just like her, it gets treated once a month with Botox, believe it or not, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So for some of you, the happiest day of the year might be Christmas or Hanukkah or the day you get a grant for your particular art project, or it might just be this conference. For people like me, the happiest day of the year is the day the census releases its data, because it means that we can dig in and find out what really happened in America. And when the last census release happened, what we found out was that the growth rate for the Latino population in the United States was 43% over the previous decade. For the Asian Pacific Islander population, also 43%. For the African American population, 12%. For the non-Hispanic white population, only 1%. So 43%, 1%, those are pretty big differences. And so for people like me, on the night that Obama was reelected with 39% of the vote, and all of those commentators were slapping their foreheads going, America has changed, I kept saying, where were you when I was giving speeches the last year? So America is changing. This is the next America. And what's important to realize about the next America is the following. When most people think about the demographic change, they tend to think it's being driven by immigration. But that is no longer true. Immigration in the country is slowing down. Net migration from Mexico is actually zero. The primary reason being that the fertility rates in Mexico have fallen dramatically in the last 30 years, from about 5 children per woman over the course of her lifetime to a fertility rate now of about 2.3. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. So as those two things come together, the change is increasingly being driven not by immigration any longer, but by the youth population. And what this shows you is the change in the youth population in the last decade. So starting with non-Hispanic whites, the number of young whites below the age of 18 in the United States, actually fell by 4.3 million over the last decade. Now, I always like to reassure people that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News. And it would have been blamed on Obamacare. So what it means is that more people are moving into 19 and 20 than are moving into 1 and 2. So the net number falls. Net number of African Americans fell by about 200,000. Some of that redesignation to multiracial, but much less than most people think. The number of young Latinos in the United States went up by 4.8 million. The number of Asian Pacific Islanders by about 800,000. That's the next America. That's who's going to be our working population, our artistic population, our consuming population. And what it means is that by the year 2043 or so, the United States will be a so-called majority-minority country that is majority people of color. Interestingly, about a decade before that, the majority of the workforce will be people of color. Last year was the first year the majority of births were to people of color. Now, that may seem like a lot of change, but we've actually been here before. If you look at the percent non-Hispanic white for the United States in 2000, it's about 69%, projected to go to about 45% in the year 2050. That demographic change in the United States over the next, last decade and the next 40 years is roughly the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. So I know it sounds arrogant when we say it, but it's just true. California is America fast forward. And it's America fast forward in terms of the demography. It's also been America fast forward in terms of the inequality that's occurred. Here, the widening divide happened in Los Angeles and then the rest of the state much more quickly than the rest of the country. And it's also been on the cusp in terms of making some new changes we'll kind of talk about as I get to the end of this short period of time. Now, it's a very interesting set of statistics. Demographers say that they know the exact day that California became majority people of color. And I remember it, actually, because I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long going, we're majority minority, we're majority minority, we're majority minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? There was a tone of anxiety in their voice. Finally, I said, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. And part of what we're doing is, and how many of you have been salsa dancing? And how many of you took that class before so you didn't embarrass the crap out of yourself, right? So there's learning a new step about these populations, about the directions that we need to take. And while it's been happening in California first, there's something really significant for you to know, which is the following. The only large of the 100 largest metro areas, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, San Antonio, you name it. The only large metropolitan area in the United States that in the last 10 years did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children, you're in it. Los Angeles. Because the demographic processes are slowing down here. The immigrant populations are older, more settled, having less children. Every white person who was going to leave has left, right? So we are in a situation in which our demography is settling. In fact, for the last 3 years, Los Angeles, which received 1/4 of the nation's immigrants in the 1980s, in the last 3 years, the share of foreign-born has been on the decline. So there's a kind of settling of this demographic process that's occurring in California. And when people think about this demographic change, what they often imagine is that, yes, the US will be majority people of color, but that's because California is going to be 150% minority, right? Super minorities, right, in California. But really, this demographic change is occurring all over the country. This is a map we've been doing with PolicyLink. The darker shades represent higher share of people of color, the darkest shade being greater than 50% people of color. In 1980, the United States looked like people often think. The Black Belt of the South, the borderlands of Texas with Mexico, the Hispanic and Native American areas of New Mexico and Arizona. You'll note if you look at California that there was only one county in California that had crossed the threshold of being greater than 50% people of color. That was Imperial County on the border of Mexico. Here's what happened in 1990, in the year 2000, and with the last census. But most significantly, here's what's happening in the next 30 years, 2020, 2030, 2040. So diversity is coming to a theater near you. That is, it's something that's happening all over the country that's changing demography. And the other thing that's really significant for those of you who are interested in making place, and presumably all of you are, is that the most rapid demographic change that's going on is no longer in America's central cities. Why? Because America's central cities are retaining a lot of young millennials, including whites, attracting some older folks moving back, the so-called empty nesters. A lot of our central cities are actually seeing an increase in their percent white. Where the diversity is occurring is in America's suburbs, and in particular in the suburbs that are the inner ring suburbs. So if you look at Los Angeles, here are the lighter colors or the whiter colors in 1980, And you could see that that's changed dramatically. Basically, only Santa Monica's left. So go enjoy it. Is the African American population, which between 1980 and 2010 gets pretty dispersed. This is the Latino population, which grows all over Los Angeles. I'll do that again. So it's not just sort of East LA, but watch what actually also happens in the San Fernando Valley, right? So now the Valley girl is La Muchacha del Valle, right? So big transformations, and these transformations, this is the Asian population. When you think of like, where's the Korean community concentrated? I know the first thought that's gonna come to your mind if you're from out of town is Koreatown, which is, by the way, 75% Latino. But where they really are is Rolling Hills, right? That is in a suburb adjoining the Inland Empire. So the diversity is occurring in our suburbs. Why that's important is because placemaking in the suburbs is also important, and art and culture is as well. And these are places that generally have low levels of social services infrastructure to deal with the new populations, often low levels of civic infrastructure, and often low levels of community organizing infrastructure, which can lift up the issues of these populations. One other thing that's very important to think about with the demography is the age structure, and then let me draw some of the implications. So has some of this been interesting so far? Okay. So really the most interesting statistic from the census is the age distribution. For non-Hispanic whites in the United States, the median age, half older, half younger, is 42. For California, it's 45, older. For Asians in the United States, about 35. For African Americans, 32. Pacific Islanders and Native Americans, around 30. For Latinos, the median age, half older, half younger, is 27. 42, or in the case of California, 45 to 27, it's 15 or 18 years, it's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain our demographic change, because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may be, go for it. But the other thing it helps to explain is the distance between generations that's playing out in our politics in terms of an older population not seeing itself in a younger population and not being willing to make the investments in education, in arts education, in culture, in a number of other things. And that has real impacts. We've been doing a study with PolicyLink which looks at spending per child for education in the United States. The lighter areas, less spending, as contrasted to the generation gap. And you could see it's basically a photo negative. That is, where the generation gap is the biggest, people are spending less on education and other investments for the future. And by the way, if you're looking at that map and saying to yourself, I don't know, maybe it's just a visual correlation. We did this using a time series cross-section fixed effects regression in which we controlled for every variable that explains the level of education spending, and we still found it. And if you didn't understand that because you're an artist and you didn't take graduate statistics, which you should have, all it means is I'm right. So these are some of the issues facing us, along with the context of growing income inequality in the United States. So the key question is then, what are the implications for place? One of the things that I think is a real implication for place, and it's something that Jamie was lifting up, is that in fact, place is not static, but constantly changing. The suburbs that we thought of as the white space of our cities are actually becoming much more diverse. There's a wonderful book I encourage you to read called Southland, which talks about the sort of changing places in Los Angeles and reminds us that South Central was once a location that had Japanese Americans and African Americans living side by side. It's actually now a place that's about 80% Latino. That's a huge kind of big change that's gone on in South LA. So we need to both uncover the histories of places and also recognize that places are not static, that change takes place and that people are busy producing that change through culture. Walking into downtown Los Angeles. So I wish, I'm conscious of the time, but what you would see if you watch the rest of it, and apparently you will, if you watch the rest of it, is you would see things that you, like, I just had a meeting yesterday. We're trying to do a project on Latinos in South LA and uncovering the history of Latinos in South LA. And there's an older woman who's going to be part of it, who herself came and was undocumented in East Los Angeles, Mid-City, and then had friends move to South LA. But the two young people who were part of it, what they wound up sharing was their love for ska punk. Because for Latinos in South LA, ska punk is apparently a really big thing. And they were talking about the clubs that are there, and there's skaters, and there's all this kind of mixing of culture. And if you went through this, you would have seen bikers. And you would have seen the fact that what they're doing is reinventing a traditional song, La Bamba, that Richie Valens made popular through rock and roll, calling it La Bamba Rebelde, the rebel La Bamba, and then having a song about the key lines of which was, I don't believe in borders, I will cross them. And making that part of making and there's beautiful scenes of the places, Mariachi Plaza being claimed by these young people with all the work that they're doing. So the thing I wanted to impart with that is that places and people are not static. Identities are not static. If you were to think of a Chicano identity, you might not think of the skaters and rappers that you would see at the end of this particular video. You wouldn't see all the work that's going on. So what are the implications then for art? You may wonder who these two people are. They're my children. They're beautiful. My son is a musician whose backup career is as a commercial actor. My daughter is a dancer who's actually benefited from dancing. Young Latina who danced with a Thai dance troupe at Mercado La Paloma in the heart of South LA. Only could happen in Los Angeles, right? So what are the implications for art? I think there's a couple from the things I've lifted up, and then I'll close to be on time. One is to understand not only this next America, but to understand it in a slightly different way. not just that the demography is changing, but that the demography is changing with youth growing up in circumstances in which social justice and struggling for justice becomes an important part of their identity. Notice that in the middle of that song by Las Cafeteras from East Los Angeles, there's a whole rap going on about undocumented immigration reform, etc. What the research is showing us is that social justice activities for young people help give them a story or a narrative in which to fit their life. And that allows them to have more resilience moving forward. So the kids who do social justice work, for example, in high school, when they get to college and maybe they don't do so well on that first exam, they don't blame it on themselves. They understand that the schools that they went to were part of a system that did not deliver opportunity equitably. They've got a story of resilience, a story of struggle. And one of the really key things, I think, for art to be thinking about, and in particular the making of place, is that the social justice story needs to be an important part of that. They're key, these young people are growing up with tremendous inequality, feeling like they've got a way to tackle it is important. The next thing that I guess I'll close with, because I am always trying to be on time, is the following. It is important, as you think about the work that you're doing and moving forward, to think about the way in which you contribute to placemaking, to think about the way in which that contributes to economic development, to think about the way in which that contributes to the revitalization of a city, but to never lose sight of the fact that what art is fundamentally about is making meaning of our lives, of our society, of our fortunes. My son, when he was going off to theater school to learn how to be an actor, which, you know, frankly, as a working class kid growing up, was not one of the careers I would have identified. We took him, after he graduated from high school, on a treat. We all went to Hawaii. And on one of the evenings in Hawaii, he and I had one of those male intimate moments, which meant we weren't looking at each other. And I said, Joaquin, you know, what is the theater school thing about? Why is it that you're doing that? And he said to me, you know, I just want to make things of beauty with my friends, which is what he's still doing as a musician. And it made me realize that in the work that some of us do around the narrative of social science, we're trying to provide some understanding of the data and framing of what needs to go forward. For folks who are working on art, they're making things of beauty, and increasingly with their friends, not in isolation, but in collaboration, particularly if you're talking about making place. And if you look at this changing demography and the imperatives of social justice, there is a world of beauty to be made. And we will only make it with our friends. And we will only make it by having placemaking and art play an important role. Thank you.
That was, oops, I'm just waiting on the mic. I think we're just going to switch over the presentation.
Sure.
And as we do that, please join me. So Yisung and the work that they do take a lot of the data and take a lot of the information that Manuel is looking at and then translate that into places and sort of how do you take that data, how do you take those people, and then how do you approach place through that lens. So let me turn things over to Yisung.
Thank you. That's quite a hard act to follow. First of all, I apologize for Thom's absence. He actually replaced both of his knees and simply is not mobile. So in his absence, the second oldest person in the office was tasked to come, and I ask for your forgiveness and understanding as we share what we do. We're the head of a group called the Now Institute. It's been about 10 years that we formed this organization. Let me see if I could, as they're switching. About 10 years ago, we looked at our colleagues across the campus at the engineering and at the science and medical school, and realized that here we have a whole group of brilliant postgraduate students working in conjunction with the professional world, where they're gaining access and experience of and the limitations and the challenges of reality, while being exposed to an incredible wealth of new kind of tooling and new issues that are being brought forth by the professional end. And they're developing now new cures for cancer and new materials. And we were just kind of scratching our head and said, why can't we do the same thing on the urban planning and on the urban design end? And if we do our research all the way up till maybe like the 1970s, the United States and the world was actually together in this kind of synergy between planning and urban design. And somewhere in the 70s, it kind of split. So the word urban planning now is more associated with policy, and then the word urban design is much more associated with design, or as we joke, one writes more, one draws more. And now we come upon a place in our society and our history where I think we have to now reclaim a conjoining of the powers of policy and the instruments of interpretation that urban design comes forth. So just quickly, if you're not familiar, this is Thom right now is the current architect on President Obama's Committee for Arts and Culture. This will actually come back to play on a project for us. He is also the Pritzker Prize laureate, and one of the reasons we were able to win the Pritzker Prize was because we were looking at significant government projects where we were advancing sustainability way before it became trendy and cliche. If you know this thing called LEED that came in 2001, we were advancing green strategies in 1998. I presented a green paper to the Clinton and the Bush administration as a way that somehow government and leadership has to take forth and actually be stewards of a larger value system for the country. And upon winning that, we went through a slew of projects that was more about locating architecture and design within a larger territory, basically of a social agenda and of community advancement. With all the books that comes with it as part of our awareness campaign. But today, I just want to kind of focus on the initiatives of what we do over at the Now Institute. We publish a series of these books that are always conjoined with our yearly research that we do on behalf of governments all over the world. And one of the examples that we did was to kind of still contribute to the LA River and all the other ongoing discussions within the city. I'm not going to present what we did chronologically. I'm just going to do it thematically into two halves. The first half is going to be culture's impact on sustainable cities, and I'll probably address that through a couple of projects that we have. We realize that culture is not static. Naturally, it evolves to reflect the changing nature of a society and nature. What we are actually very kind of cognizant of is that we look at history. Now, it might be a little bit strange for the group at Morphosis to look at history if you're aware of our architecture, which formally might be a little bit assertive. It's simply because I teach history I used to be at USC, now over UCLA. The recognition of history is a recognition of progress. It's as simple as that. And so once everybody understands that and understands that history and the definition and the advancement of culture is not a static enterprise, we can all now be comfortable in appropriating the legacy and the heritage of those who came before us, especially the raison d'etre of the places that actually conjoined and that actually contributed to the making of that community. So for us, culture actually means heritage, the arts, and ultimately a sheer sense of identity. I think as human beings, we are driven to differentiate ourselves. Every one of you are dressed differently. All the hairstyles are dressed differently. We oscillate between personal identification and our differentiation within the community, but then also kind of go back to the identity of the community as a whole. This map kind of shows you all the cities that we've worked with, from Los Angeles to Madrid to New Orleans and Beijing, and right now for 2 years we're down in Haiti. So the first project that we did is culture and sustainability. And let me just go through this. We were asked by the city of New Orleans after Katrina to come in and do an assessment plan. And our assessment simply kind of understood what everybody colloquially understood, which is basically you should not be living on the lower Ninth Ward where there is actually a historical kind of example of flooding and hurricanes. So if we know that basically hurricanes come to New Orleans every 3 years, perhaps it's probably wiser to actually do a much more proactive multi-generational planning. We actually advocated for a reduction of the New Orleans footprint and put that to the city. And while that, by the way, that is actually a diagram of hurricanes every 3 years going through New Orleans. We also understood that as we propose something macro, that at the same time, and these are basically the growth of the city, and that actually represents the flooded zones where 80% of New Orleans was underwater. We also had to then understand that perhaps communities still want to identify with that place, even if ecologically and infrastructurally, it was actually a wrong strategy. And so with that in mind, we also came up with, okay, let's then design a house. So we took basically the legacy of the shotgun house, which is what this is in plan, and was determined to actually build like a Noah's Ark, a house that would float in case it would actually flood. And what we ended up doing was that we actually did that within our institute with the help of the Make It Right Foundation, which was spearheaded by Brad Pitt, and proceeded to actually construct this building out here in UCLA, ship it across the United States, drew into the New Orleans, and actually now established here. This house is operational. A family is living in there. The house is capable of actually being off the grid and floating, truly like a Noah's Ark for about 20 days in case of a severe flood. And this somehow represents for us the larger macro and the micro level of engagement with these urban policy issues. So, and from here, we went into a conversation and a collaboration with the Obama administration. Obama at this point was really interested in looking at rescuing 8 dying American cities. And the middle-sized American cities were defined by population of about 500,000. And they were simply dying because their manufacturing base has gone overseas. And I'm not going to go into the 8 cities because this one is more about a survey of the Now Institute. But that project was called the Cultures Now project. It spanned for 2 years. We had to deputize 8 universities, including Harvard, MIT, UPenn, University of Michigan, Ohio, and Arizona, and all to basically look at their own specific cities that the White House has basically located. And the interesting thing about this is we first began to actually criticize the government, even though the government was actually asking us to do this thing, by also understanding that the United States actually ranks 11th in terms of the government's patronage of the arts and culture. And we're 2 notches under, let's say, for example, China, which is a government that you might not assume has such formidable policies. And only 4% of the grant is now actually given to the arts, cultures, and humanities. And this is actually, for me, very telling. Of the Mayor's Institute on City Design, the grant disbursement of 2011 of $3 million, only $3 million was divided among 25 cities. So by the time any city got any money, it was only 100,000, and we all know 100,000 really doesn't carry much for a city, especially if it's the size of LA. And this was actually kind of interesting. It's a diagram that we kind of drew based on statistics, where the size of the dots actually represents the amount of funding that the government grants. So this is, of course, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, House and Urban Development, and the EPA. Now, there's actually a 5th institution, which is inside that little dot. That's the NEA. If we blow them up, that's actually the real size relative to the data. So Given this kind of an extraordinary environment, we are faced with a lot of policy challenges as well as challenges on the ground. So, our recommendation, of course, to the administration is let's conjoin and basically use the culture as a literal and strategic stitching among all these institutions. And this has, and I know right now the diagram is rather simplistic, but for us, it actually represents more like a Trojan horse. Rather than a position of resistance, one versus the other, it's like, okay, let's do more research and let's actually be smarter about it, where I'm going to actually do more like a Tai Chi move, where I know what you want, and I'm going to actually use that for me. And it's probably the most realistic way of actually conjoining all the forces together, rather than saying, oh, you're bad, I'm good, and locating territories. So, for example, so one of the things that we did, and this is purely speculative, of course, 7 out of 10 of the US cities are actually in the Southwest, believe it or not, of the largest US cities population-wise. And future growth, we deem, are actually located within these territories. And on this future growth, we actually looked at the Sun Corridor as an engine for Tucson, Arizona, which was one of the 8 cities located by the government. And at Tucson, we realized that 2% of the Southwest land area can theoretically power 100% of the U.S. power demand. Even if we were to be completely conservative and shave this by 75%, is still a significant number, at least statistically, on paper. So, places like Tucson has 350 days out of 356 of getting sun. And so spatially and kind of graphically, we began to just understand the impact of these solar farms on the city. When we do things like this, we're not advocating for these huge farms of solar voltaics landing in the middle of the city, but it provides everybody with a real visual graphic scalar, kind of a representation of the impact on the urban condition. And so, for example, in 2020, we could actually have this capacity where by 2040, Tucson now becomes an energy exporter and actually now takes advantage of something that is inherent to the local culture. So it's this mode where research actually allows us to legitimize an architectural and a spatial and a strategic position on behalf of all constituents. The second part is actually on culture and specific on urbanism. This one actually goes back now to the origin of our group. This is when we actually were conjoining with the city of LA to do these studies of looking at how to bring in 30,000 people within the city. At that point, we weren't looking specifically at demographics, but we're just looking at even just the possibility. But in order to do that, at the turn of the century, we realized we had to produce an almanac for the city. And LA Now 1 represents an almanac where every single map, every single data was mined and collected and kind of redrawn under the single authorship of the institution. One of the shocking discoveries that we did was, of course, none of the departments talk to each other. So the way that the city would be divided by the Department of Engineering, the Bureau of Engineering, was completely different from transportation, MTA, completely different from all these other divisions. So somebody had to kind of bring in and actually make sure that the right hand was talking to the left hand in terms of having a comprehensive platform. So these are just pages where one of them was actually kind of the location of culture, but culture located both within a definition of art and culture also located within the definition of basically race and ethnicity. And through a photographic kind of representations, the complete redrawing and kind of making a comprehensive documentation of the entire city, and then making proposals such as this that allows governments to actually speculate on the future. For those of you, for some of you, you probably remember a time when cities everywhere in the world would just kind of come out with this, LA 2020, LA 2040, LA 2050 visions. And these were like these somewhat kind of heroic, maybe sometimes a little bit nonsense, but what they did was that they were aspirational. They were aspirational, and even though they would have had, let's say, certain kind of problematics embedded with them, it allowed everybody, every citizen, to kind of understand a certain kind of territory of what the government intended to do, and at least we could actually critique or support that idea based on a comprehensive document, right? A comprehensive document that had actually visuals. That time has now long gone. And now most of the government in the world in planning are relegated to enforcement. It's enforcement, and it's basically advancing like a current set of rules and zoning protocols rather than aspirational advancements. So this is where we come in as kind of like a surrogate component of the planning department, which they used to have, and say, okay, this is what we can do for you. So given 3 years of LA, we were now in Madrid, and now Madrid has asked us to look at the 3 different kind of peripheral suburban cities. And this is what we do. We take all the demographic data, we take all the physical infrastructural data, and we actually now propose a series of speculative strategies that actually are actually a wide spectrum of issues. So I could give them, okay, you want something that is a complete developer-friendly, worse urban spaces, but you just want to make money. Okay, this is one version of it. Okay, you have another one that's completely off the grid, all sustainable. Here's another version of it, and then here's like two or three other versions that's like within the spectrum. It's not about promoting one. It's about giving an intelligent tool for the planners to kind of make an intelligent decision. And so this is what we did with Madrid. They're trying to increase density by 300%, but simultaneously also increase green area by 300%. So how do you do that, right? So you have to now understand topography and actually how communities get together, where you could actually now efficiently package community centers. So it's that territory of design where we were coming in. And so one of the examples that we were doing was we looked at how housing in the Mediterranean area relied on this close density and kind of speculated on these type of projects. I know we're running out of time, so. And here we are using examples of basically these wind catchers that you could see everywhere if you go to like Istanbul and the entire Mediterranean area. We rely on basically kind of a close density proximity because there is a cultural legacy in terms of community space sharing that has come from that region. It is not a proposal that we blindly just said, okay, oh, this is how we like it to look, just do this. It actually came from an analysis of heritage and legacy. And these are tiny units, but the tiny units actually are kind of strengthened by the density of which they want to kind of live within this proximity. So that's actually one example. And now currently, we're in Haiti. I've been in Haiti for about 2 years. I just came back from Haiti after a couple of weeks. And we're in Haiti because right now, again, in conversation with the Obama administration, but also more independently with UCLA, ultimately, our desire is to affect policy. With no policy, we could talk end on end. And really, the entire kind of advancement of creating kind of places becomes a lot more kind of arduous. So as we understand and as we participate and as we contribute to basically kind of the grassroots agenda and at the middle tier an agenda for the developers, ultimately we are curious, but we also believe that at the upper level, once we affect policy, it starts to kind of rain down. And it's a difficult position for us to understand, but with Haiti, and given our studies over in Africa, once you actually have a government that is trying so much to do with so little, you actually are in a position where you actually can get up to the government level. So within a year and a half, we've been now mandated to look into Haiti by the government, resurrecting their cities. Haiti has a proud legacy, and this is like the last piece I'm going to end with. They were defeated. They were the only country that defeated Napoleon, other than the English. Christopher Columbus landed in Haiti, so there's a lot of these legacies. The earthquake actually, of course, destroyed a majority of the city, But the amazing thing about the people of Haiti is that they have this amazing capacity for art. Okay, I remember when I was doing actually a study on basically post-violent resilience, and we were looking at Fukushima and how the Japanese would actually try to kind of find a security, and for them it had to do with community organization. You know, so you saw pictures of people lining up for some water, even though there's complete devastation. There was like no police, but people will actually police themselves. I remember looking at basically the communities in Sichuan, where after the earthquake, they went back to their clans. So every community has a different way of going back to that one singular route that actually provides them security. And for the people of Haiti, it's arts. So in this complete devastated landscape, you saw art everywhere. Everybody was trying to make art out of literally the debris and the chaos of the surrounding. And with that, that's been now our main strategy for the government. So this is like art that you see, and this art here, these artists, they actually started to present themselves over in UCLA. And then, so these are a series of these almanacs that we did. There's a first of this type in Haiti, where for us, it's a way of kind of legitimizing our understanding socially and culturally of a nation and of a people that we are completely unaware of as of like 2 years ago. And so the Now Institute absolutely relies on a collaborative experience of understanding all the data that comes from it that are both quantifiable data and qualitative data. And so everything that we do relies on a series of partners on the ground that do actually kind of provide a scholarship as well as colloquial informations of what it means to be on the ground. For example, we're just simply asking, you know, Haiti has the greatest percentage of a coastline relative to the landmass, but no one fishes. No one uses the water. Why is that? Because culturally, the water was always seen as a source of attack from foreign invaders and colonizers, like the French. So for them, even the name Haiti actually means mountainous land. So for them, culturally, it's about the mountains. That's where they feel comfortable for. It's not about the water, even though all of us will come into Haiti and say, oh my God, you have like this amazing resource. Why aren't you doing something with it? So it's that level of cultural awareness that we have to locate our strategies with the government. And so after doing a series of this is like a 550-page book that's going to be released in 2 weeks for the government. I'm just going to go through pages. I'm not going to bore you with all the explanations. We actually do go out on the field and meet with community leaders and get their experiences, empirical information as well as statistical information. And finally, this year, after doing a year of due diligence and goodwill, we are now officially tasked by the United Nations and by UNESCO and the federal government to revitalize the city of Cap-Haïtien. This is where Napoleon was defeated and where Christopher Columbus landed. And our job is to replan this city. And we're going in there because, I'm going to show you why, this is where the historical center of the city is. This is where the template for the French Quarter of New Orleans was actually from the city of Cap-Haïtien as a legacy, as a DNA. And so if you go to the historical core, very beautiful, very tranquil. But this is actually a small part of the story. The real story is actually on the backside, which is this. And it's this incredible river that right now, about 8 years ago, was actually a very, very clear running water, has now turned into an open sewer. And now we've been asked to remediate this river and replenish this informal settlement community vis-a-vis the instrumentation and the strategies of cultural awareness, basically community placemaking, and I'm not using that word only because we're using it, it's actually the word that we're using with the government, and as a way of understanding how they live as families, as a way of actually now promoting a whole new kind of sustainable method of urban planning and urban design. And so I've just been tasked with this job of 2 weeks ago to actually now plan a revitalization and phasing diagram for this city. And hopefully this is where we're going to be, and hopefully we can actually remediate this and then return it to this glorious path. These are the fortresses, and this is actually now the cover for our future book on captation that hopefully we can release with the government. But ultimately, I'm showing you this because at the end of the day, it actually does rely on us kind of understanding where community lies. Do I have time just to show one more? I'm going to just show you a real project that actually came from what we do at the Now Institute. We won this competition to do the Olympic Village housing in New York 2012. Had New York gotten it instead of London, this would have been built. But I'll tell you one reason why we got this. This is off in New York, out here in Queens. And it's right here, this site. And we actually kind of designed this long, snaky bar that actually had all the athletic housing. Now, the reason we won this was not because of the shape of the housing or the design of the housing. We won it for one simple reason. We did research. We did research into the needs of the demographics up in this community and realized basically the children had no access to parks and to any athletic field. And that became our singular mission, was to actually propose a long-term plan that after the Olympics are over, that we actually give over about 75% of the facilities here back to the community. That was a done deal. And that's where we realized the power of kind of understanding community needs and understanding the larger kind of cultural legacy of each one of these communities at multiple generational phases, which is actually the kind of key to make a long, sustainable community. And I go around and I talk about the word sustainability is not really about energy. Energy is about 30% of it from an engineering point of view. Sustainability is actually, half of it is, of course, technological, but the other half really has to do with culture. Regional specificities, heritage, lifestyle, legacy, behavior patterns. And we are now entering a period where sustainability cannot just be a copy-paste enterprise all over the world. Every region, just like politics, just like the notion of democracy changes everywhere around you go in the world, we've now entered that phase of sustainability and the role of meaning to each kind of community. So we simply have to do our homework and understand that in order to serve this group and to actually win this as a professional architect, for example, it really relies on serving this need that was technically outside the boundaries of what we did. So what we did here was that we basically swapped it out. And in the end, we believe then it's a win-win solution for a lot of different groups. So I think with that, thank you. Thank you.
So let me kick things off with a question for each of you guys, and then I will open it up to the audience for conversation discussions. We'll have a couple of mic runners who will be doing that. Manuel, one of the questions that sort of consistently comes up around a lot of the work that folks are doing is who authentically gets to speak for a place, or who are the locals? I was in a session earlier, I think it was Michael, I can't remember, who said that his community's definition of local was when the last person who remembers your arrival dies, right? That's the moment you become a local. But I think from the numbers you've shown us, places are constantly in flux, people are moving. And just as folks begin to approach projects in their community, that notion of sort of local, outsider, interloper, gentrifier, immigrant, I mean, there's sort of a collection of words and ideas there. Is there any helpful advice that you have in terms of how you begin approaching that, how you ask those questions, what questions you should be asking, who you should be asking them of?
Oh, what an easy question. So,
Solve it.
I mean, it really is sort of the question. So I'd say two things about it. One is to recognize, again, as I mentioned, that places are not static, that they're changing over time. And that who is local actually does change over time. And that captures the transformation of Koreatown, Westlake. It captures the transformation of South LA. And it captures the way in which people remake those places as well. I think, and one thing to note about this in particular is that when people often define successful communities, they think about successful communities as places where people have been for a very long time. But for immigrants in particular, successful communities can be platform communities, places that are pretty good springboards to grow out of after having been there for a while. And I think that's important to think of. So let me just say that I think to some extent it's the wrong question. The reason why it's the wrong question is because what you really want to do is improve people's lives and improve the places that they live in, instead of thinking that somehow those are counterposed. And if you go into the idea of improving a place without thinking about the paramount issue of equity, justice, inclusion, and democracy, then gentrification and displacement will be the result. If you go in to improve a place thinking about who lives there now, how can their place there be honored? How can they find a role in the new community that's going to be emerging? Then you're going to start thinking about mechanisms to make sure that people can buy in. You're going to think about rent control mechanisms so people don't get priced out. You're going to think when you're doing transit-oriented development that you surely don't want to displace the people who actually use transit, right? Instead, you want to try to make sure that you've created a lot of affordable housing, et cetera. So I think that we're often thinking about the wrong question in terms of authenticity, instead of thinking about whether or not we've got a program that reflects the best values of equity and inclusion, even as we're transforming place and creating opportunities for people.
Is that better? Okay, great. So just a quick comment because of the transit-oriented development mention. I mean, that was by far the largest dot that you showed in terms of the government federal agencies, was the Department of Transportation. I'm just curious, in the room, how many people are involved with a project that significantly involves transit in some way, some sort of transit-oriented development? So a lot of us, I think, are already going where the money is. And sort of going after that, and then that stitching together of the dots. We spent some time this morning talking about the concept of field building, and did we want to create a field of creative placemaking? And what's interesting is you and Thom sort of posited that culture could stitch together a field out of sort of disparate federal agencies, which is an interesting thing. But my question for you is sort of from a nuts and bolts tactical point. You know, you talk about sort of the Culture Now Institute. You want to understand the culture of a place. So something like the Olympic Village that was up, you guys were citing it in one of the most diverse places that I know of, in terms of number of languages that are spoken in Queens and number of people who've come from other countries and all of that. When you approach a place, when your firm begins to approach a place, what are the questions you ask first? What are sort of the foundational things you need to understand in order to say, okay, we're beginning to have an understanding of this place?
Well, I think first and foremost, we recognize that we enter a project as complete students. Because, you know, experience kind of shows us that to kind of make any product or any strategy that even has a possibility of a paradigm shift, or any notion of doing something that can even come close to being useful or original, the worst thing you can do is actually come in with a presumption. And so we come in and we actually look at every information that are quantitative as well as qualitative, set of data and backgrounds. And from there, we start to kind of call a larger kind of a strategic map to address the larger issues. First and foremost, we're physical planners. And so we know that the limit or the aspirations or the extent of what we can do is to actually interpret all desires from a community into a physical, dimensional, spatial construct, right? As architects and planners. But then number two is that we realize that if we actually kind of locate certain kind of economic and community-based kind of desires, and at one point they seem to be two different kind of constellations, but the more kind of research we do and the more people we actually meet and find like-minded partners, we could actually now conjoin them into a win-win scenario. And you know, we're constantly on the implementation side of this. I'm constantly out there, as most of you are, in the field, meeting the developers, meeting the bankers, meeting the community leaders, and you're always on the ground. And the one thing that I'm always kind of trying to basically tell my team is don't presume, don't assume, and just like listen for clues, because everybody has a desire, right? And everybody has a need. It's really simple. And the whole game is to see what magical cocktail can actually do a need. I satisfy your need and I satisfy their need in one comprehensive strategy. And that's where one group of planners will be differentiated from another group of planners. It's not all the same formula. And sure enough, some are more successful, some are not. But I think that's it's coming in with the idea that we're always students of the system, and we listen to every tier of the government. I mean, of the stakeholders, and it's not only just the grassroots. It's not only at the government level. It's vertical, and because at the end of the day, we are living in an integrated vertical society of the macro and the macro, and we come a long time ago from a position where it's always about a position of resistance. And after a while, and I think in this new kind of age, I think from resistance, we've gone into a position where we're trying to kind of make partners in ways that those individual partners probably were unaware of the possibilities. And I think that's where we are right now.
That's great. All right, so I'm going to open it up to everyone, but as I do that, one of the things that I was sort of most struck by in Manuel's presentation was the change that's happening in suburbs, and suburbs as a site of major change. How many folks in this room are involved with projects that are located in a suburb? Was anything in what Manuel said sort of interest, of note, changing the way you're thinking? I'd love a suburban question first, and then happy to do a free-for-all. So I know Jen Hughes has a mic, and there's some other mics. And if there are, in fact, no suburban questions, we'll take any question. Great. All right, so let me open it up to anyone. We've got down here. Just wait for a mic for 1 sec. Great. And if you just introduce yourself, and then feel free to ask the question.
Actually, it was. Okay. It was actually just to try and coax out a little bit of what you were just asking for. Are there any existing programs people know about that are in the suburbs and are interesting? Might get something more on that.
Well, we had a bunch of hands go up, and so I would posit that all of those are interesting programs in the suburb, but that's just because communications for ArtPlace. But are there, Manuel, let me just ask you, are there folks that are specifically looking at what's happening in suburbs? Because I know there's a lot of sort of urban planner, urban design, urbanists in the world. I think there's a growing number of folks who are sort of looking at rural development, but I actually don't know any suburban planners or suburban designers.
Well, I think the field's changing a bit. So First Brookings has been putting in a lot of work looking at the changes in suburban America and actually differentiating in a way between our inner ring suburbs, the older suburbs that are very much adjoining the city, and the sort of more exurb areas. So I'm going to give you a couple of facts and then some examples locally that I think are important. So our suburbs in Los Angeles County have exactly the same demographics as the city. Exactly the same demographics, including in terms of share foreign born. Our suburbs generally have slightly higher poverty rates, actually, because particularly the inner ring suburbs that are the sort of Maywood, Bell Gardens, the old hub cities heading on down to Long Beach. Our suburbs are more fiscally starved, as is the case all over the country. And part of the reason why is our suburbs were set up under something called the Lakewood system. And the Lakewood system was an opportunity. You could create a suburb without creating any city government. You could contract with all of it from the county, which worked just fine as long as you had a sort of middle class, self-sufficient population with very few needs. But what happens when the suburbs diversify and poor people are there and you don't have any real city services? So all of those things are going on here. Are there interesting and good things going on? Yeah, if you go down the San Gabriel Valley, the amount of projects in the San Gabriel Valley, which is basically suburbs, that are trying to redesign their central corridors to become more lively, very interesting. The current deputy mayor in Los Angeles, Rick Cole, who got awarded just 2 years ago, City Manager of the Year, cut his teeth on Azusa, California, which is an inner ring suburb, heavily Latino, downtown distressed area. They helped to recover it. He went on to do that up in Oxnard, Ventura, another sort of more suburban location. So there's a lot of really interesting work that's going on. And actually the other kind of interesting stuff that's going on is people realizing that this is a place where a lot of community organizing needs to take place as well. So some of the most interesting immigrant rights organizing has actually gone on in places like Maywood, places you may never have heard of. Some of the most interesting environmental justice organizing has gone on in places like Huntington Park, which are actually inner ring suburbs. So there's a lot of really interesting work under the radar, and I imagine there is in some of the places that you all are nodding your heads, the suburbanites, that's going on as well.
Great. All right. We have a question from Hong Yi Lee. Just wait for a mic for a sec so our folks online can hear you.
Hi, folks online.
Use all three of them.
I'm the Queens Council on the Arts, and this project 2012 was a very interesting time for us. And I'm just wondering if you had done any research. I mean, you did uncover a very blatant need of lack of green space and athletic fields for the children, but there's also this resident ownership of black car industry and generations of people owning land that refuse to let it go, and in turn has affected the zoning of this area, so that there was never a resident population, there was never the ability for artists to own in the way that Dumbo or other places in throughout New York, artists were able to actually own, buy, negotiate long-term leases and actually feel part of the community. It's always been transient. And the other thing is, my project was a transit-oriented project. It was the number 7 line from Times Square across northern Queens to Flushing. And one of the monikers for us, or the places where we actually gained our knowledge, was from the census, of course, but we also worked with the libraries to see where all the foreign-born children 5 years ago were now going to school. So we had an idea of where our arts programs should be, where all the teens were reading Portuguese, where the Bengali kids were going, and we had a lens through the local libraries, because to this day that was still the churches and the libraries are the touchstones for first wave immigrant families. So my transit project was really based on data that I just, I'm not a demographer, I'm not a statistician. I did not take statistics, I'm really sorry. But I figured, where would I go? Who would know?
There's still time.
I'm running, I'm gonna go. But I use those kinds of data points, and they have been extremely useful to me in figuring out where people are sending their kids to school, where they're sending them to soccer practice, and it corroborates everything that you have said here. But I use those kinds of, ask my local librarian, talk to the church pastor's wife in the Korean, those kinds of very anecdotal type of places to get the research, and they might be humble, but they have been extremely telling, and we have 147 different nationalities that we have to keep up with underneath the line, which to this day is still the same Gothic journey. It's the same immigrant journey from Flushing to Times Square as the train my father took for 30 years. And it's still the same. And I wonder if it's a psychic memory. I wonder if that's embedded into the DNA of this train. But 500,000 people ride that train every day, and they're working now to transport or transform that journey into something more than just get me from home to work, but take me someplace else.
If I might say two things about that. One is that psychic memories are indeed deep. My mom grew up in Spanish Harlem, and every time I'm there, I feel like I'm home. And it makes no sense at all, but somehow it's deeply embedded in her stories. The second thing I think that you're lifting up that I would suggest to folks to think about is the data collection process that you're talking about, because there's a tendency to think, particularly for you in this world, that this, art, and maybe we can, get the community involved in the co-creation of art, but surely the statistics we're going to use will be just from the census and all these hard scientists. One of the things, and some of the folks that are associated with Nancy's work has been part of this. You're going to go to Mercado La Paloma, and they've also been doing this kind of participatory community research. So for example, we worked with the folks from the Esperanza Housing Development and Second Baptist Church. It's the second oldest black church in Los Angeles, the one where Martin Luther King went to go do his preaching when he came to Los Angeles. And they wanted to understand their neighborhood, so we provided these demographic profiles for them, but health promoters, promotoras, then went out and did surveys in the community about what people needed. So it provided an additional data point, but it did something more fundamental. It created a mechanism of communication between the church and the community through the presentation of this data, and it created a set of ownership of the data itself, including the census data. We've been doing work on environmental justice. We do a lot of documentation with pretty fancy tools. We often also include something we call ground truthing, which is having people in the community go out and document what the hazards are, see whether or not they're actual in databases we're using, and the sense of ownership they develop around the data and their capacity then to talk about policy is really important. So the data collection is also a community building and a community confidence enhancing measure, and that part of it should be respected and built up as well.
That's great. All right, anyone else? Next question? Let's go right here.
Hello, yes. My name is Russ Rubert. I'm from Springfield, Missouri. And since it's Springfield and you've been talking about the New Orleans thing, I have to say, home of Brad Pitt. And also, I just flew in from Guadalajara yesterday. So one thing we're trying to do at X Factory is reach out to the Contemporary Artists Society in Guadalajara and see if there's ways we can engage them locally. And so I found your presentation really interesting also. The IDX Factory, we think of it as an ideal laboratory for art and architecture that allows for kind of a rapid prototyping of space. And some of the questions we've been asking ourselves is, what is an experience catalyst? What happens if we treat physical space as interface? How do visitors perform their attendance at an event, and can the space itself take that into account? How can a location or event surface the experience of the people present, and how might a place record and perform its own history? So I thought I might get your comments on some of those.
I think the phrases that you mentioned are kind of paraphrases of what we actually use in our own discussions. And I hear you about Brad Pitt, but I also realize that strategically that somehow implementations, like a B-level implementation is still better than an A+ implementation that's just on paper. And And in some regards, you actually have to go out to the field and kind of be ready to take on some of the difficult challenges as you put forth and make a lot of these issues real. There's a project that right now we're thinking about talking about here in LA, which has to do with a long sector of a corridor between two adjoining cities, and it just has to do with about bringing back, let's say, like a technological research programming on these abandoned factory buildings. And the whole discussion really came down into semantics. So it came down to transforming the word art, and then it went into culture, but somehow to the people that I was like talking to in the room, art and culture was still very loaded, and it still seemed to be divisive. And so through something very simple, we just ended up calling it creative spaces, which for a lot of us is a very cliche term, but to a particular audience, as soon as you kind of throw in creative, and it's like all of a sudden like creative technology, and then it kind of broadened every kind of lateral business or field into jumping all on the same kind of bandwagon of kind of a cultural creative aspiration. It ended up not being like the corralling noose that I was able to use to have some anchor guys that are definitely big money guys, but they wanted to be creative. So why don't you just be part of this community? And I know right now there's like the big elephant in the room about gentrification, but at the end of the day, you get these guys as the economic engine, and they kind of buy into the role of basically kind of the physical community making as well as the cultural community making. And then we were able to get the meeting going. And as soon as the big diesel locomotive started to move, then you could start kind of fine-tuning the discussion points between how heavy-handed these guys are going to be and how slowly, gently, we can actually get them off the train. But there was basically a series of strategic kind of conversation that I realized that we had to do when we actually get, let's say, these guys on board or off the board. And I'm just measuring this directly to your comment because let's say, like, you know, Brad Pitt has a pejorative perhaps issue. You could say good or bad things about that whole program, but at least it got the discussion going and something was actually made. And over the long course, I'm very much strategically in the mind of using research as a way of locating kind of Tai Chi-based strategies of making a win-win solution, because I tell you, this has been successful all over the world. Okay, I deal with this in China, I deal with this in South America, and in the end, human beings are the same. We have a need. There's going to be the creative group, which is us, that have somehow conjoined ourselves into a certain kind of political position, and there's like others that are maybe on the other side of the fence, and there is a way of merging these things so that we're all on the same train and all going. I'm helping the city of Beijing expand its city because guess what? 500,000 people are moving into Beijing every year. 500,000 people are moving into Beijing every year. They are now going to do the most sacred thing, which is actually they want to plan this huge piece of national park between the northern part of Beijing and the Great Wall of China, right? We're tasked to do this. How do you do that, right? The government's going to do it anyway. So the government started to kind of demonize these things, and right now we're still in the middle of it, but it's a way of not conjoining forces, because otherwise, if you don't do this, guess what? Those guys are just going to roll over you and steam over all the grassroots efforts. And now, of course, I'm talking the extremes in China, but I take China and I take Haiti as the most complete extreme conditions of governance and community participation as lessons to actually maybe speak more intelligently and more strategically to a group here in the United States.
I think that's great. Manuel?
I wanted to offer the following, which I think, by the way, that idea of convergence and collaboration is important. I just want to put a good word for conflict, which, you know, currently, if you ask people about Martin Luther King, pretty much everybody will say, yeah, it's a great guy. glad we have a holiday, right? Really advanced civil rights in the United States. People hated him in the 1960s. He was raising all sorts of uncomfortable issues. He was doing it in a very principled way that brought people into the conversation. But he was a troublemaker. He was investigated by the FBI. He was the subject of numerous investigations and arrests. There was a lot of conflict. The people who are raising the issues of gentrification, they're not trying to stop places from transforming. They want to be able to live in those places as they get improved. The people who led the fight for the living wage here in Los Angeles set in place a series of kind of transformations of political power which led to the community benefits agreements that govern the expansion of LA Live right by the Staples Center, and actually set the template for a recent struggle at USC's expansion in which the community didn't get everything it wanted, but unless it had struggled and fought, USC, the place where I work, would have done nothing around gentrification, job development, or anything else. You can go around these issues of park access, right? That's not just coming out of the good of people's hearts. That's coming out of a lot of struggles on the part of communities, principled struggles, ones that eventually try to find the sweet spot, but that actually sit and do that. So when you think about collaboration, the words I'd like to leave you with is that collaboration is principled conflict, right? It's about having some principles that you're going, I mean, if you're collaborating and everybody you're collaborating with already agrees with you, they're just already on your team, right? You weren't collaborating, right? Principled conflict is about having principles that you're going to try to achieve, dealing with the challenges that you were talking about, et cetera. And then having some principles about how you conflict with people. Not a fight that leads you to demonize the other side or accuse them of only caring about, staying in the community or only caring about rapacious development, because we need the community organizers and we need the developers too. We need the artists and we need the business people. But there's going to be conflict in it. And the conflict is actually what helps to produce the creative change. So, just my good word for conflict.
Excellent. Pro-conflict. Eric. Applause for, polite applause for conflict. I like it. Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric Takashi. I work with the Local Initiative Support Corporation in St. Paul. Dr. Pastor, you said something about how some neighborhoods have served as places for people to grow out of. And I just want to ask if that's a paradigm that we have to accept, or can we actually use arts and culture as a lever to create places where people will choose to stay even as they may make economic gains because of the very culture of the place?
It's a really good set of questions. I guess what I'm pushing back against is I'm just not sure if you go to Pico Union, just west of here, which has a pretty high churn. People move in, people move out. That's wrong for that place. It should be a decent place. It should be a place which has culture and opportunity. It's got transit. It's got good access to jobs in downtown Los Angeles. But it's the place where people arrive. It's the place where people arrive where there's rich immigrant networks, and it's the opportunity for them to exist in those networks and to be able to survive. And they need to move so that other people can take advantage of that place and the networks that exist in that place. So I'm just pushing against, I think every place should have great creativity and arts and culture and be a vibrant place to live. But some places churn. And that churn is actually part of being a good platform so you can receive more people later in the future.
And this is probably a simplistic and simple-minded question, but
those are the best kind.
At least it's what I'm good at.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about gentrification, and we talk about sort of community churn. Is there a sort of accepted working definition of gentrification? When does churn become gentrification?
No, there isn't. And I actually think that the term gentrification, which I know even I used, is the wrong term. I think the thing you want to look at is displacement, right? Because if gentrification means that you're bringing in some folks who have assets into a community. It's going to help to revitalize there's a really wonderful book I encourage people to read called There Goes the Hood by Lance Freeman. It's about New York. And actually, he's an African-American guy, and he decided to write a book because every time he'd go get his hair cut in the barber shop, right, he was like, oh my God, there's gentrification and people are leaving. And he said, geez, I'm going to write a book, and he did about Bed-Stuy and Harlem. And he found a very complicated story, which is that there was some displacement, but that also some people who were there liked the idea that there were better amenities in the community, and that to some aspect there were things that improved in their lives. So I think that the real question you need to ask is not whether or not there's gentrification in the sense of a gentry moving in the sense of, a Whole Foods finally arriving, right? Which, by the way, it's about to come into downtown Los Angeles, and everybody's like, oh God, the mothership. But whether, maybe, but whether or not there's displacement that's going on. One of the things that's been interesting and there's displacement in downtown Los Angeles because this is also where Skid Row is, and the Arts District is conflicting with some of those services. But frankly, part of what's gone on in downtown LA is there was a lot of empty space that people had moved into. When you think about some of the development that's going to connect downtown Los Angeles through South Park with the university, there is the real potential of displacement, particularly because in that particular area, something like 2,000 units that are Section 8 units are about to turn over in the next 10 to 15 years, and there's no place, since they can't be renewed, they will be priced out. I mean, then there's a real issue of displacement, and how do you make sure that people can enjoy the benefits that this development might take place? So I think we need to focus in on displacement. If you focus in on displacement, then churning isn't really a problem, right? Because people are leaving of their own will in order for more people to be able to be there, and they're moving on to other places. If people who've made an enormous investment in the community themselves, maybe not financially, but simply by living there, being part of the fabric, can no longer afford to live there, that's displacement. And unless you've got strategies in place to make sure that they can have the choice to stay there as the place improves, then you're focusing on place and not on people. And the secret of this entire session is how do we incorporate place and people at the same time.
And just, Isung, let me ask you, you had mentioned this a little bit with New Orleans and the need to sort of shrink the footprint of the city. Right. And I think of Detroit, which I think is struggling with some issues similarly, or even Baltimore, the Station North District, which I'm somewhat familiar with. And there's a lot of empty space there. There aren't the people to displace, and what do you do with that space? As someone who's sort of looking at cities and sort of looking at holistic communities, just do you have thoughts about that sort of notion of displacing people, empty space? How do you keep different kinds of housing? I said in a session a month ago or something, we need to improve the opportunities for home ownership so that we can avoid displacement. And Mark Stern at the University of Pennsylvania said, well, actually, you need to maintain a significant rental stock because otherwise no one can come into the neighborhood. No one has that sort of first toehold in. So just from your lens, can you just sort of comment on some of those issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk in terms of New Orleans and Haiti. In New Orleans, it was very clear that when we were tasked to kind of make an extreme kind of objective study based on a set of criteria, that because of this recurring 3-year cycle of basically natural disasters, that from basically economic plight and infrastructure plight and kind of urban management, it was just basically this repeating problem. However, at the end of the day, we realized the deep kind of cultural affinity and connection with that troubled land that the community just refused to move from. So at the end of the day, that trumps any kind of objective analysis that you do and that you make a recommendation to the city. And where kind of community and legacy and heritage is ultimately the conditions with which binds the families together and which ultimately gives them their identity. And so at the end of the day, the identity does trump any kind of pragmatic data, and that's why then it went into a phase 2, which has to do, of course, with the Brad Pitt sponsored Make It Right with a Noah's Ark as a response to preserving the location, but then using technology as a way of now keeping the resilience ecologically and engineering-wise. Over in Haiti, there's actually no land tenureship. Only 2% of the land is accounted for legally. On top of that, every community, the government wants to kind of literally remove and displace huge groups of people that we were looking at this thing and we just know this is going to be impossible. And so at this point, we are now trying to work with the government in terms of a policy where they could actually regain their land tenureship vis-a-vis by a bartering system of community teaching and community service. And right now, our main apparatus is actually the midwives of the community. And by actually having the midwives, they're actually the soft administrative nodes of the community. They have all the gossip. They have all the real desires. And so that's now our strategy. We get all that data back. We kind of package it in a nice way, and then we report it back up to the government and have the government kind of affect the policy that could actually kind of affect that. At the end of the day, you're not going to break a community or family or an individual's sense of belonging. That's completely clear. What you want to do is that can you raise their status of living but still retain that identity? I think that's always been the conundrum. So, you know, absolutely the issue with displacement is bringing amenities, a counterpoint to that. Is that a pejorative? I think that's like the larger question.
You know, the thing I wanted to add to that, I think it really comes up in your example, is to also be concerned about cultural displacement so that the place changes in a way that people no longer feel welcome because certain kinds of businesses have been displaced or certain kind of markers. And I mean, this is a silly example, but it's such an important one. My son lives in Echo Park because that's what every hipster in Los Angeles does. He's also a vegan. He's basically an LA stereotype. So anybody who knows that Los Angeles and Echo Park knows that Echo Park's been through this big revitalization, and it just opened up, and fortunately a lot of people are going there. My son, naturally, while the fences were still up, snuck in there one night, and then immediately came in and called me, which made me think it was an emergency. And here was the nature of emergency. He said, "Dad, none of the signs are in Spanish," right? That's ridiculous in this community, right? And it just made you, I mean, you can now go enjoy Echo Park if you speak English, right? In terms of understanding the interpretive stuff that's there. I mean, that's a major mistake in what's a landmark feature of a place in Los Angeles, which, by the way, also hosts the statue of Jose Marti, the sort of liberator of Cuba. So it's those little kind of miscues. And then I think it's also looking in placemaking to ask, what are some key businesses here that if we displace those key businesses through rent increases, et cetera, we're losing some of the important cultural cues of the community that are going to lead people to feel welcome. And you know what they are in your particular locations.
Great. All right, let's take one last question. I can't quite see it. Everyone's pointing at Jane. Over here, yes, great.
Hi, I'm Lori and from Boston, Upham's Corner ArtPlace. But I wanted to think with you guys or with the whole room, like this conversation seems tremendously rational. Planning is rational, data is rational, but like culture and place is not often rational. And I think having artists as part of a conversation, we're often those insider outsiders. You know, we're the queers or folks with disabilities or hobos or, you know, those folks with hunches and liminal spaces. So I appreciate data and I learn a lot from data, but I'm also wondering, like, how do we think as places are gripped in sometimes with irrational and rational fears about change, how do we think about using our other skills, our less rational, our more cultural skills around helping people think about other options? Like, it's not just about, are you going to be forced to leave, right? But what else is going on, or what else can artists bring to the conversation that help folks come up with new ideas, or help folks learn from the folks who have always felt like outsiders in their communities? Those sorts of things. Thanks.
Everyone turns to Manuel for the irrational.
Again, thanks for a very easy question. I mean, you know, frankly, it's interesting because I do a lot of work in environmental justice, and I've got this very heavy data-laden presentation on environmental justice that about 3/4 of the way through says facts matter, but not that much, right? I mean, at the end of the day, people tell themselves stories that are remarkably inconsistent with reality. Like immigrants take all the jobs and they don't work and take all the services, right? So I think there's no real replacement for on-the-ground community organizing one-on-one that essentially does a very important thing, which we don't often think about, and maybe this is a good way for at least me to end, is it sort of humanizes the other, right? And it makes that conversation take place. What it reminds me of is when I was in graduate school, which is a stressful time. I used to play basketball every day because it made me feel like I wasn't in graduate school. And this was in 1981 in Northampton, Massachusetts, and it was the second year that I used to play basketball every day on the street. And they were going to have a gay pride, the second gay pride parade, and I got asked to be I'm not gay, I got asked to be a marshal for the gay pride parade. And so I said, yeah, sure. And so I was a marshal for the gay pride parade, and while I was marshaling and walking along and stuff like that, like everybody I played basketball was on the side, and they were like, right? This is 1981. It was a much more homophobic, particularly in sports kind of era. And on the Monday, I came back to the court, and you know, they said, well, are ya? Right? And I said, what difference would it make? And for the next year, I played ball as a gay basketball player. I was sort of the...
You were the first.
I was sort of the Jason Collins of my time. And I remember at the end of that, one day I was picking up a check from the bank with my wife. I must have been very happy about the check because I gave her a kiss. And one of the ball players came up to me and hugged me and said, you're straight, right? But the point was that for a year, they were forced to act as though the other was in the room, right? They were playing with a gay ball player, at least they thought, right? And they had to curb the homophobic comments and deal with their homophobia. And what I've always kept from that is that we ourselves need to act as though the hobo or the queer or the person who's incredibly marginalized or the immigrant or the African-American mother struggling, as though he or she is in the room, even if they can't physically be in the room. That if we act like that, and then we work to build the community organizing that actually connects communities together, we can begin to really build out the picture where the data does matter, because we get beyond the irrationalities and fears of the other. But to do that, we have to meet the other, and those of us who are in rooms where the other isn't, we need to make sure that that other is in the room, even if they can't physically be there.
I think that's So I think that's absolutely where we need to end this session, because I don't think we can do any more than that. Liz, I think I'm supposed to remind everyone that buses will start leaving for the best party you've ever been to in your entire life between 6 and 6:30 from the lobby downstairs, and that buses will return you back to the hotel from the party. And are there any other housekeeping? Nancy, do you want to add anything? Wait, come here, into the mic.
Thank you. I was asked earlier today about food. You're going to have extraordinary food, so please don't eat before you come. And it will be our great joy not only to welcome you to the Mercado La Paloma, which is an inclusive community development that was done entirely without displacement, but that we want you to have a wonderful time there, and I'm hoping that everybody will get a chance to interface with our beloved Damon Turner, who has actually been more focused on this conference perhaps than anybody else, which is why he's not here. But he's going to be throwing a wonderful evening for us, so welcome.
Thank you for that. So let me just, please join me in thanking one more time Manuel Pastor and Isu.
Okay, just so that everybody's clear, so we're gonna